Welcome, everyone. My name is Morna Gerrad. I am the archivist for Women's and Gender and Sexuality Collections at Georgia State University. And Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Lisa Vallen, and I am the Southern Labor Archivist at Georgia State University.
We're very excited to have you here for, I think, one of the most important topics relating to oral history. We're going to talk about policies and ethics. You really need to have all of this stuff squared away before you even think about doing your first oral history. You've got to think about making sure that everyone you're interviewing is comfortable with the process and understands what the process means. So I'm going to start by talking about informed consent. That really is the core of everything we do with oral histories. We don't want anyone being interviewed who doesn't understand why they're being interviewed, what the interview is going to look like, what's going to happen with their interview, what they can do with the interview, all of that stuff. That needs to be figured out and shared before the interview actually takes place. And I'm going to go through some of the things that you need to think about when you're creating your processes for doing oral history. And the first thing to ask yourself is the interviewee actually able to consent? And that seems a silly question to ask, but there are instances where legally somebody's not actually able to consent. And one of those instances is when you're planning on interviewing someone who is under the age of 18. They are considered to be a minor, and certainly all of the interviews that we do in special collections, if someone is a minor, we must get their parents' permission in order to go forward with the interview. And the parents will be involved if we're talking to the potential interviewee ahead of time. We would want the parent to be with them while we're having conversations with them so that they completely understand what the process is. Another issue that might come up is somebody may be older, and we do interviews with older folks, and unfortunately, some might have dementia or memory issues late in life. And you need to take that into consideration. You could say, well, maybe if they get somebody who's, their caretaker to sign off on it. I don't think that's good enough. I think if someone is at that age is not able to give consent, I don't think you should be doing an interview with them, not for a project like the kind that we do here in special collections. Now, it's possible that you start an interview with an older person and you have no idea that they have dementia, and it may only appear once you've started the oral history. And I actually have an interview that happened with. I think it's fine to give her name. Her name was Greta DeWald, and she was this amazing woman who worked for the Carter administration and did great things for the Democratic Party. But by the time we were interviewing her, she clearly had dementia. We discovered once the interview took place. What we did was we did not make that interview available. We didn't stop the interview straight away because that would have made her feel awful. We wanted her to have a good experience while she did it, but we decided not to use the interview once we had it in our clutches, because it did not represent who she was at the prime of her life. And I think her family would have just been horrified that her struggling to find words for things would be kept forever. So that was how we decided on that. You also need to think, does somebody have the freedom to consent? Are they in a situation where they are in charge of their own well-being and their own lives? Are they a prisoner? Because from time to time, people have been interviewed in prison. What does that mean when you're doing those kinds of interviews? So you need to, it's not everybody actually has the ability to consent to the interview, and you need to be really cognizant of making sure that they do. Another thing you have to think about is, do they have all the information that they need in order to consent? Do they, have you provided all of that information to them? It's one thing to call somebody up and say, I want to do an interview with you in 3 weeks' time. Are you up for it? And they're like, sure. And that's like, I personally don't think that cuts it. I think you need to do a lot more than that. And Lisa's going to touch on this quite a bit when she talks to you. We produce for all of our oral history projects interviewee packets that have all sorts of information about the project, about what happens during the interview, about what happens to the interview afterwards, all of the kinds of information that somebody would need ahead of time. We provide that with quite a lot of lead time before an interview. And then we follow up with them. It's like, have you had a chance to read this packet? And if they have, let's talk about any questions that they have. Are they concerned about anything? You know, and most people have something that they want to talk about that, you know, usually what's going to happen to the interview is the main thing. One of the things I will point out is, like, I think Lisa's going to share one of our packets. I will say the language in our packet tends to follow the language that you would find in the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, that works with human subjects. We, as oral historians in special collections, we do not need to get IRB approval for what we do, but we follow IRB rules anyway, because it's ethically sound to do so. And so all of the information that we provide in our IRB and in our interviewee packets really is the same information that you would provide if you were going through IRB. I will say some of that language is a little bit stiff and a little bit academic, and I acknowledge that. So for a couple of my projects, and one in particular, I have a transgender oral history project. I actually created an online research guide for folks that used language that was much more understandable, much more layman's kind of language, to explain exactly what was going to happen with the oral history and what to expect. And we also provided information about, because we do a lot of these virtually, even, you know, how to do a Zoom video chat, because some people, this might be their first time doing that, and they might be a bit nervous about it, but we give them some hints and tips about doing all of that kind of thing. I think to feel like you're going into the interview as partners in the interview, and that you're sharing as much information as possible about what's about to happen is really awesome. So with you know, I said earlier, you know, I will follow up after I send an interviewee packet to somebody. If I'm doing an interview virtually, we tend to meet with the interviewee a few days before the interview again, just to do a quick tech check, we call it. It's like, is the lighting okay? Is their internet strong enough to handle doing an interview? You know, but at the same time, that allows us to have an opportunity to talk to folks about, again, like, these are the things that are going to happen during your interview. Do you have any concerns? Reiterate all of the things that you want to make sure that everyone understands. And it gives them some freedom just to sort of chat again. And actually, to be honest, the day of the interview, when you're starting the interview, we have the same conversation again, not the full length one, but we remind them, it's like, you don't have to answer any questions you don't want to answer. You know, we can stop the interview at any time, all of that kind of stuff. We sort of reinforce that again and again and again. And, you know, we let them know, you know, what their rights are in terms of providing access. And I'm going to hit that just in a second. So have they been given adequate time to understand and consent? We hope so. We plan that into our consent process. I would definitely recommend that you don't just do an interview, like call somebody up and say, let's do it next week or let's do it tomorrow, because that doesn't give them enough chance. I will also say, you know, best practices are best practices. We had a situation a few years ago where somebody we wanted to interview for a very long time didn't tell us they were going to be in Atlanta till the day they were in Atlanta. And we had one day to do an interview, and they allowed us to take a couple of hours of their time to do that interview. We did not have the time to do all of this, these processes. But we made sure that we, you know, attended to some of those issues and follow up after the interview. So best practice is best practice. And sometimes, you know, you can't always do exactly what we're telling you to do now, but try to make sure that you follow it as closely as possible. And you can use follow-up to sort of, you know, if you don't have the opportunity to do everything up front. Can the interview withdraw from the process? And this is something that comes up in an IRB application. Absolutely. We always let an interviewee know it, like, at any point of the process, whether it's just a day after they've said, yes, I'll do the interview, to the day before the interview is about to take place, to the moment we're about to start, to halfway through the process. And then even afterwards, they're like, if they say, you know, I wish I hadn't done that, we're like, that's fine. We will not let your interview be used. So, and there's no penalty for that, where there's nothing's going to happen that's bad. We're very clear about that. The person has complete control over their interview. Does the interviewee understand how the interview will be used and shared? Well, we hope that they will, because we're going to show them. I'm sure you do the same, Lisa. I will send my potential interviewees, not just their interviewee packet, but I'll send them a link to different versions of different kinds of interviews that we've done that show different levels of access for the interviews. So the interviewee can see what it looks like online, because it's really weird. If you've never been interviewed before, you have no idea what it entails, what it's going to look like. It's just such this like vague thing that's out there. Is like, and I think if you can show somebody what's actually going to happen to the interview, it demystifies the process, and they can see that it's actually not a horrible thing. And you know, so I will send usually a video. I will send something that has audio only. I will send something that has a video that's been synchronized with the audio, with the transcript. I'll, you know, whatever versions I have, I will send them to the interviewee so that they can make some educated decisions. Does the interviewee know what they can do with their own interview? Yes, we will always make sure that they know what they can do with their interview. The release form tells them that they can use the interview in whatever way they want. The interviewee packet also tells them that Georgia State will maintain the rights to it, but the person being interviewed also has the right to use their interview in any way that they want to use it, and so does their family. So we make sure that they know that they can do any of those things with their interview. Do you want to go into the next bit? Okay, so let's talk about some more issues that I think are really important, and I don't think that get enough consideration. Power imbalance is something that you really have to look into. If you're interviewing someone and you know they're younger than you, there's a power imbalance with that. If you interview someone who maybe has English is their second language, there may be a perceived power imbalance with that. Class can come into it, educational level, ability, disability, all of these things can come into it. There are lots of cultural aspects to this in you know, if you're interviewing folks, and I think this came up when we were doing trainings with folks for the We Love Bu High oral histories. These were oral histories that were conducted by quite young interviewers with older members of the mostly Southeast Asian community in on the Beaufort Highway sort of area. And there are definitely power imbalances between the young folks who are interviewing the old folks with there's and their cultural sort of norms add into all of that as well. So before you do your interview, think about those folks that you're interviewing, think about where the discrepancies might be, and try and find ways to make this an equal playing field, at least an equal playing field for the person being interviewed. For me, I kind of prefer to give the person being interviewed more power in the interview process. You know, they are they have complete control over what they want done with the interview, and that is that's reinforced to them the whole way through doing the whole process. How are you going to address potential confidential information being shared? This does come up. This has come up in a couple of different ways for our project. In some instances, a person might talk trash about somebody else. You've got third-party issues, and there have been lawsuits in the past about this. So we are aware of it, and we try to sort of mitigate as much of this as possible. If they talk trash about someone who's in the public sphere, if they talk trash about a politician, that's fine. If they talk trash about somebody who's not, then we were getting into some gray areas. Likewise, if somebody who is being interviewed tells you that they've done something illegal, or starts to tell you that they've done something illegal, that could become an issue. What I generally do in those instances, both with the sort of the trash talk and the sort of discussing legal issues, I might pause the interview and just take a moment and talk to the person being interviewed about the implications for all of the stuff that they might be sharing moving forward. And then we can start up again if they're happy, sharing their stuff. That's up to them. But we want to make sure that the informed consent process about that is fully sort of used, so that they are not surprised at the end of the day when somebody is very unhappy that they've been badmouthed in an oral history that's gone online, or that somehow the police come after them for something that they did 10 years ago that they thought was safe in an oral history. An oral history, if it goes online, is it's publicly shared, it's not private. And so, folks really, really need to understand that. Now, sometimes things will come up and they're subtle enough that you might not catch it during the actual interview. And it might be in the transcription process where you're like, you know what, that maybe is something that we should be concerned about. In those instances, we probably talk to the person who was the interviewee rather, and suggest that maybe we edit part of or redact part of the interview, so that the original is maintained as it is in our records in special collections, but the publicly facing version has those pieces removed. And that has worked quite well in the past. There may be, if they've said something bad about someone, we can have an opening time, many years forward, that we can make the whole of the interview available, or we may even talk to our legal counsel about what did they disclose about their illegal activities. Is that something that actually applies to the state of Georgia? Because some things are illegal in Georgia that might not be illegal in another state. So you kind of have to know what is and is not legal in your own state. A great example of this, and I like to give examples, is there's we have done interviews with trans individuals, some of whom had to take part in basically survival sex work, and that obviously is not legal in the state of Georgia. So we want to make sure that we talk to folks about that. If they took part in this work in another state, we would want to look at, was that legal in the other state? Usually I go to our legal counsel and just say, these are the issues that we've got, what can we do? And our legal counsel is always, the answer is always protect the interviewee at all costs. Whatever you need to do, protect the interviewee. They're not usually as concerned about Georgia State being protected, it's the interviewees that we need to protect. And so that is our main concern.
Another example is with the IRA interviews at Boston College, I think, where they got these great interviews with IRA members and put them online, and it was fine for quite a while. And then the FBI found out about it and subpoenaed Boston College to get the full interviews, so they could use the interviews to prosecute these people, the interviewees. And Boston College, fought it, but ultimately lost. So we can't promise confidentiality. We will do everything we can to make sure to do that, but we cannot promise it. You cannot promise it.
Yeah. If it's known that these interviews exist in any way, then folks can come and ask to access them. They have to go through our legal counsel and go through a whole bunch of hoops, and they may get denied at the end of the day. But the Boston College case was one that really kind of rocked the oral history world on its heels a little bit. The case that comes up a lot around third-party issues is one that was out in California, and a rabbi had been badmouthed by somebody in his oral history, and many years later somebody discovered that interview, and the rabbi sued the university, and it went back and forth through many appeals and counter appeals and all sorts, and at the end of the day the rabbi lost. But it made us as oral historians a lot more careful about, finding those places in interviews where that happens, and trying to mitigate the sort of chances of that, being an issue. I do have a couple of oral histories with women who were at the state capitol trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified, and they have some terrible things to say about politicians. Who were groping them or saying terrible things to them, and we would have to sort of they were public figures, so we can probably err on the side of we can share that, but for us, having legal counsel, not everyone has legal counsel to go to. If you're working on a project where you have concerns, go to a repository who has interviews and talk to the oral historians at that repository, and they can probably guide you. Don't get yourself into trouble unnecessarily. Don't let anyone else get into trouble unnecessarily. You need to protect them. The interviews that we do are not meant to be, we're not like journalists. We're not trying to have gotcha moments or anything like that. We do interviews that are life stories, and we want this to be a positive experience. This shouldn't be something where somebody feels that they're in any way at risk for anything. So I think I touched on this before. Who owns the copyright of the interview? Georgia State owns, but for us, the ones that we do, Georgia State owns, or the Board of Regents owns the physical oral history as well as copyright. But we share basically it's, the person being interviewed has the rights to use their interview in whatever way they want to use it. I personally, after I get my interviews done, I will send my interviewees a copy of a video or the audio or the transcript, whatever I've got, I'll send that to them anyway, and then they can do with it whatever they want. It's up to them. How are you planning on providing access to interviews? That's really, really important, because that will affect how people approach their own interview. I absolutely hate seeing myself. I can't even stand looking at myself right now when I'm on this video. I hate seeing myself on video. And I was interviewed for the Women's Marches, the Women's March Oral History Project. And I was adamant, I only wanted audio. I did not want a video. So I know that my interview is an audio only. It's online. I'm happy with it to be online. Some people don't care. They're okay with seeing themselves online. Some people, may not want to be identified even. So I touched on this earlier. we have multiple ways of making things available online. Our favorite way is using a synchronizing tool to synchronize the video or the audio with the transcript, and it's searchable and it's awesome and wonderful. And that's great for people who are very comfortable with everything being out there. But we have other options, and Lisa's going to touch on the release form later. And this is something that we discussed well ahead of doing the interview. Someone can choose to be online, everything out there. For me, I chose to just have my audio online out there. I'm totally happy with that. Some people might want to have nothing online. They don't want anything online at all because they don't want to be identified as you know, they may have done an interview about a challenging topic that their family might not agree with them, or they might get into trouble at work. So they don't want any of that online. They want to be completely anonymous. So in those instances, we'll make a transcript available in the reading room only. That's all that they can have. And then there's all these other gradations in between. You know, you can have audio with your names removed, although to be honest, the sound of your voice is pretty, you know, people can tell it's you. I'm just saying that. You can, you know, you can have video and or audio with the transcript, but in the reading room only. You know, it's like we have all the options for anybody who wants to decide, and we allow people to make the decision based on, you know, their own comfort level. For my projects, I also allow people to change their mind. We get a lot of folks who say, no, put it online. I'm happy. It's fine. And then they'll think about it after the interview, and it might be a week after, or it might be a year after. And they'll come back to me and say, you know what, I would rather it was taken down, or you make it available in a different way. This actually happened quite a bit after the Women's March oral history were conducted. I had a number of folks start off with saying, I want it anonymous, too many family issues, don't want to, you know, the story is important to tell, but I don't want people to know it's me. But quite a few folks did their interview, it was online, and suddenly they were applying for a job, or they were running for public office, and they contacted me afterwards and said, can you please take it down? And I said, absolutely, with the caveat that once something's been online, it's been online, and somebody may have that somewhere. It's cached somewhere, and it's impossible to remove it completely from everywhere online. So, you know, that's why the informed consent before the interview is really important, that you make very clear, you know, what the decisions that they're making actually mean. But I definitely allow folks to change their minds at any point. And I feel like making it clear that the interviewees have all the power in their interviews, I think really helps set up the interview to be more frank and honest and forthcoming. If somebody is nervous about what's going to happen, they might self-censor. Whereas if they know that whatever they say, they can control at the end of the day, then they may be a lot more comfortable, more forthcoming with their story. And I feel like that works really, really well.
So before we move on, we have one question in the chat. Would certificates of confidentiality cover any of these issues? I think back when we were talking about confidentiality issues, and I think the answer is no. It could still be subpoenaed. I am not a lawyer, but is my understanding there's really nothing we can do to make things truly confidential. If you get subpoenaed, you have to turn over the records.
Now, that is us as a university, a state-run university. And to be honest, I don't know what the legal implications are for a private project. But certainly for us, it's not easy for people to get access to interviews that we deem as, you know, the confidential part of them, but they can apply, and they have been successful in getting them. So that's something that we are always very conscious of here at Georgia State. But ethically, you know, you really should be having these. You should be considering that anyway. At some point, you may be donating your interviews to a repository that does have all of these sort of like layers in place that would allow, you folks to come and ask for what we think are confidential things. So you just really need to be as upfront and open as possible with people being interviewed.
Yeah. Okay. So documentation. Oh, was there a question?
Hi, this is Susan Votner. Morna, I wonder if you mind if I chime in on that real quick? Yeah, so the NIH Certificate of Confidentiality does protect against the subpoena, but I don't know if it would work for oral histories, and you might be able to answer this, Morna, that because if that information is disclosed by the researcher, it kind of takes the place of that certificate of confidentiality. So if it was just a certificate for NIH funded studies, then it would protect against that subpoena.
Okay. Thank you.
Then we have one other question.
Yes, I just had a quick question concerning like copyrights and things of that nature. I might have missed it. I've been double tasking, but just in doing my oral history for my dissertation and planning to give it to the archives, am I still able to write books and write articles and things of that nature, or does this now become property of the archives?
You as the interviewer, sorry, I should have said that too, because it's usually it's the family of the interviewee are the ones that are like, they want to go crazy and they want to do stuff with the interview. But the person who conducted the interview, you're also signing the release form, and you can do with it what you want to.
You can also, if you donate it to the archive, but you're still not done using those interviews, have basically the archive embargo those interviews for a certain number of years. They can't be made publicly available until you have published.
And we do that. We've done that before, and we're happy to do it.
And
But I will say, if you are doing this, I'm glad that you talked about it. I would recommend, if you're going to donate them to Georgia State, contact us and we will share our release form, because you're better at having that signed up front. And it's, signifying that it's coming to special collections here, than us having to go behind you and follow up with the person being interviewed. I am currently working on a project where that's happened, where the person donated 18 interviews. She got releases for her, but not for here. And I'm really struggling to get people to sign releases so that they can be used here. So I'm glad you asked now.
Thank you.
And we're going to dig more into that in just a few minutes. So documentation, as you do an oral history project, you are going to generate documentation, and it is incredibly important for you to preserve that, because it allows you to formally track what has been agreed to and by whom. This is a field where you really want to be clear on what's been agreed and leave no ambiguity. And so the best way to do that is making sure that you're preserving your documentation. So what should you be preserving? Your communication with the interviewees, whether it's, email exchanges, or after you've had a phone conversation, you kind of just like jot yourself a note about what was covered. Just in case there are any questions, you can go back and know exactly what was said. Your interviewee packet. I always, as part of an oral history project, I have an interviewee packet that I give the interviewee. If there are any notes written on it, I preserve that. And I also just kind of have for the project as a whole, that packet in that documentation, so I know what has been said, what information has been given. Part of my interviewee packet, I have a biographical information sheet I asked them to fill out, which helps guide questions that I might ask. It's useful to gather as much information as I can. And so I make sure I preserve that as well, and any other biographical information, like they'll send me their CV and things like that. So definitely want to make sure we preserve our release forms or deeds of gifts. I will not take a collection, an oral history collection, that do not have release forms. It is just, in the end, not worth it, because it is incredibly hard to get someone to sign something after they've donated, or it's been 5 years, like, nah, I don't need this, like, I don't need to respond to this email. You're never gonna be able to get it signed. And if we don't have release forms, we can do nothing with those oral histories. It's game over. So it's incredibly important that you preserve them, both for your own research, but if you also intend to donate to the archive, they are going to require those. And then also your research and notes, especially if, again, you're going to donate it to the archive, they might find that useful. I do kind of like collections where not only do you have the oral histories, but also you have like information about the process. It can be really educational for future oral historians. And then also your list of questions that you ask in their interview. And I handwrite notes as I'm interviewing someone of, okay, they only answered this question partly, I need to circle back, or we've gone off on a tangent, I need to follow up on these things. Is again just really useful, and you should preserve it. So for your releases and your deeds of gifts, here's some questions that you need to think as you are creating these documents. So, and also as you're creating your interviewee packet, this is all kind of cohesive. So what are your long-term plans for the interview? Is this a community project where the interviews are going to be stored and shared within the community? Is this a research project that's going to result into a thesis or a published work? The type of project and the long-term plan for the interview is going to dictate kind of what's in your release, of, you know, confidentiality, of how it's going to be used, how it's going to be shared, and all of that. And so having an idea of, okay, this is a community project, but we're probably at some point gonna want to put them online and share them, and like maybe like do a documentary using them to promote the community and help tell their stories. That needs to be laid out in your release, so that again they have informed consent, they know what they're agreeing to. Do you think you might donate them to a library or archive? If so, it's super useful to have a line in your release that these might be going to an archive, and granting the archive permission to care for these interviews in the best way the archive sees fit. That saves us a lot of time on our end. We love it when there's that line in there, because then we don't necessarily have to track somebody down and get them to sign a new release or a new deed of gift. And so even if you're on the fence, it's useful to have that line in there, just to safeguard. Is the end goal of the interviews to post them online? If so, you explicitly need to state that in the release, that it's going online and that you have their permission to put this online, and that they also have have the ability to withdraw from it going online. That also needs to be in there, that they always have the ability to be like, nope, I changed my mind. Again, like Morna talked about, like once it goes online, you kind of can't undo it. Once it's online, it lives forever. Especially, you know, Internet Archive has the Wayback Time Machine where they crawl websites, like it's probably been crawled. And so you need to make sure that your interviewee is really comfortable with this. And if they aren't, is there ever a time period where they would be comfortable? Is it, you know, in 10 years? Is it after they die? You know, again, memorializing that in your release is incredibly useful. Also, it's important to talk about how it's going to be posted on shared online. Is it just being posted in snippets on social media versus the entire interview is going to go on YouTube? People are going to have different reactions to that. And so again, it's really important that they are informed about this and it's memorialized in your release. And also in your release, does it have the ability to specify if things need to be redacted? So like we talked about, sometimes confidential or sensitive information is going to be discussed. Is there a mechanism that interviewee can use to ensure that it's not made public? Again, you can put a time period on it. I love putting a time period on it of like, yeah, okay, in 10 years, I'll be comfortable with this information. Or like, this can never see the light of day. It needs to be left on the cutting room floor, like never. And again, your release has to have a mechanism to talk about that. do not ever have your interviewee sign a release or a deed of gift before the interview. You have to wait until the interview is complete. So that way they know what they've said and they can decide what they're comfortable with. Sometimes they're totally like, yeah, great, awesome, no big deal. Sometimes as an archivist, I have concerns. And I might proactively be like, yeah, we don't need, you kind of thought we paused and stopped recording, but we actually hadn't. And then you started talking to me about medical conditions that you have. I'm just going to cut this because it's not relevant to the interview we had, and it's sensitive information that doesn't need to be made public. And like Morna mentioned, you know, sometimes later on down the road, they have thought about it and they're not comfortable with this section where they talked about a fraught friendship going online. And so we can always remove that, especially if they let us know before we put it online. And it takes us a while to process these interviews and put them online. So there's definitely a window. And so we can always amend the release to indicate this. And it's always good to amend the release so that, again, you have it written and signed somewhere that this is what you have agreed to, especially, again, if you're going to donate it to an archive, that all of this is documented so the archive can follow what you've agreed. If it's not there, how are we supposed to know? Or at least like an email chain to go with it, to be like, oh, okay, things have changed. And so libraries and archives are going to require the releases. And in addition, we're going to require whoever donates it to sign a deed of gift. So like I talked about, you need the release in order for us to do anything with the collection or the oral histories. And we require a signed deed of gift with the interviewer or whoever is donating, so that, again, we have the ability to care for this collection in the best manner. And part of that is also giving us some kind of copyright. So that we have permission to provide access to researchers, that we know that like we can put it online or we can't, that, you know, we can license this to a researcher or we can't. All of that is going to be laid out in our deed of gift. And just our copyright, again, does not supersede the interviewer and the interviewee's copyright as well. They are still free to do whatever they want with this interview. And that does not affect us at all. We're happy for you to do whatever you want. It's yours. We just need legal rights so that we can do what we need to do. Okay, so some key parts of the release. We need personal information, your information, the interviewee information. This is a legal document. That all of that has to be there. We need the purpose. What is this interview? Maybe a little bit about a project, just like a couple of lines. Can it go online? Who owns copyright? How can the interview be used? Basically, you both can do whatever you want with it, is kind of the end goal. Access, who can view it? How can it be used? And then long-term use, is this going to be donated to an archive? So here is an example of a release and deed of gift combo that we use in the archive. So you can see in the top, we have all of the personal information. And then the first line is what the purpose of this interview is. And then the second is that, you know, is the property of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University, and that the content is going to be made available for educational, scholarly research use, and subject to standard archival practices, and that it's going to be without restriction unless designated elsewhere. And then you're waiving claims to rights and interests and titles to this content, assigning rights to us, and that, you know, we're waived from liability. And also, you know, can't be held for defamation, things like that. And then we have the ability for the interviewee to say what level of access they're comfortable with. So it can be made available without restriction. can only be accessed in the reading room. Can be made available online, but personal information must be redacted, so they have to be anonymized. And then the most restrictive of, it can be made available in the reading room, but it has to be redacted and anonymized. And so that, you know, they can choose, and it's clearly laid out.
Lisa, there's I actually have a more recent version of this release form that also includes date of, like, a restriction date, so they can choose how long they want something to be restricted.
Yeah, what I've also done is at the end, just below the signature box, we've like handwritten in, okay, this portion has to be redacted for X many years, and then we both sign. Just so it's all right there. And then the point 4 is GSU grants the interviewee and interviewee's descendant non-exclusive license to retain and create copies for however they choose. You can do whatever you want. And then giving our contact information, it's like things need to be modified. And then the last line, what I've talked about, that GSU, the archive, is going to care for the content in a manner that best provides for its preservation and at the same time makes it most readily accessible to researchers. And then we have the signature block. A more simple release that I have used, some of the interviews I do, you know, with my labor union members, we're not really touching about sensitive, confidential information. They're pretty straightforward. And so we don't necessarily need that. And again, we can always modify it at the end. You know, we can handwrite in that, you know, this has to be restricted, this has to be redacted. That is always an option. But it's basically saying that the interviewee understands that this is going to be made available for educational and scholarly and research use. And then it gives a whole bunch of examples of how it could potentially be used. I do like that part. And that it might be put online. I think we say like the World Wide Web. And also future technologies, because we don't know what the future holds. And we've run into issues with interviews done in like the 70s and 80s, and there was no internet. And so they never made a statement that it could be made that widely available. So we can't put it online until we get permission again, because at the time, the internet did not exist. So I like leaving a little bit of wiggle room for us. And so then we're going to care for the recording in a manner that's going to best provide for its preservation and make it most readily accessible to researchers, the exact same line that we saw in the previous deed of gift. And then understanding the above information, I hereby give the recording and transcript of this interview and the literary and copyright inherent in the recording to the Special Collections Department of the library, so that it can be used for that. Except as may be set out in any addendum here. So again, we can make changes. So these are kind of two different types of ideas of kind of agreements that can be used. Feel free to steal parts of it for your own project. That is why we are sharing it. We are always also happy to talk through some of the things that need to be there. We can share more examples. And can also always take a look, though again, we are not lawyers. We cannot give you legal advice, but we can talk about best practices. So are there any questions? And also again, if you have questions and you don't feel like asking right now, or you get further into your project, feel free to email us. We are always happy to help and always excited to hear about new oral history projects. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, drop questions into the chat.
We're also, if anyone wants us to share any of our interviewee packets, we're happy to do that too. And you can steal anything you want. We don't care.
Can we provide the link for the previous workshop available on YouTube? It is not yet up on YouTube, so I cannot provide the link, but it should be up by the end of March. And so we can always send an email out, or you can email us asking for it. And talking about previous workshops, we still have more workshops planned. So a week from now is going to be Brittany Newberry and myself talking about how to plan for an oral history. So talking through all the questions you have to ask as you're starting to down this process. On March 1st at 2, Josh Hogan is going to talk about the best practices for recording and preserving oral histories. And then on March 8th, Morna and I are back for an extended session, an hour and a half, on tips and tricks for oral history interviewing.